Ecclesiastes chapter 12. Some of you may have heard there is a popular country song that was written some time ago by a country music artist named Brad Paisley. And the song was, "If I Could Write a Letter to Me." And I would say the majority, any of those of you who follow country music at all, have probably heard that song and you understand the sentiment of that song. And really, when we're approaching this study kind of geared towards young people, it's kind of caused me to reflect a little bit and think about the days of my youth, the days when I was the age of some of these young adults and the teenagers. And it's kind of given me cause to stop and think, if I could go back and talk to myself at that age, what sort of things would I want to say to me? And what changes would I want to make? And I hope in our reflection of some of these things, as we're talking to these young people, that these things will be helpful for you in considering your days as young adults that you've been given that are very precious, and cause you to stop and think and examine and see where you can make improvements that will be for the better in your life. So a couple of weeks ago, all these lessons, by the way, very general, apply to everyone. I just wanted to give some special attention to the young people. Maybe for those of you who are visiting, this may be a little bit odd, but just focusing a little bit on the young adults for various reasons we discussed in the last time we talked about this. I'll not get back into. But because these days are very precious, and like all days, these days are very fleeting. And I think there's a tendency in our day and in our time to think about this period of one's life as a period of time where we're just waiting for adulthood. And it's not really until adulthood that really we start to be valuable and significant in the context of the local body. And that's just a lie of the age. That's just a lie of our culture. That's even a lie that sometimes the church has presented to us in the way that we treat our young people, and sometimes overlook our young people and don't give this attention to our young people. And so I hope as we consider some of these things that these will be helpful. The last time we talked about fleeing temptation. And certainly there is an expectation that God has and that we need to have for ourselves, that we do not fall to temptation to sin. But I also want to encourage you in this lesson that we not fall to the temptation of complacency. It's not just that there's stuff we don't need to be doing, but there's stuff that we do need to be doing. And I think that God gives us an opportunity, even in our youth, to be faithful in. So this morning we're going to talk about faithfully fulfilling our roles as those who are young. The Ecclesiastes writer writes this in Ecclesiastes chapter 12. "Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come, and the years draw near, of which you will say, I have no pleasure in them." I don't think this is news to anybody that the young adult years, the teenage years, are really, they are really a formation time in one's life. The habits that you begin now will stick with you and either help you or hurt you. And it's important that we examine those things and consider how can we take advantage of the days in which we've been given to honor God, to remember God, to grow in the things of God, to put Him first and foremost, so that the days of later on will be not more difficult for me, but easier. In 1 Timothy chapter 4 and in verse 12, Paul writes to Timothy, he says, "Let no one despise you for your youth, but set the believers an example in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, in purity." And I just love this passage in connection with an emphasis on young people, because though, we don't know 100% for sure how old Timothy was, it's very likely he's in his mid-20s at this time. But at the same time, Paul looks at him and he considers him to be a person of youth. And what he says to Timothy is, don't let that be a stumbling block. Don't let that be something that someone holds against you. Don't let it be a restriction that you feel is placed on you as the value of what you have to offer to the church and the value of what you have to offer to the kingdom and what you can accomplish. He says, even in your youth, here's the command that I'm giving to you, young Timothy. Be an example. And that's kind of an incredible thought when you consider the age spectrum that's present in this room. The difference between some of you and some of our older members in this congregation are decades of difference. But if I was to ask Brother Bartley, for instance, not to call you out as the older generation, but let me just ask you this question. Are the young people capable of encouraging you? Absolutely. And I think sometimes we lose sight of the power that we have through influence and example. And that can happen in so many incredible different ways. But the problem is sometimes there is a stumbling block that we place in front of ourselves, that there are simply things that we cannot do and things that we cannot accomplish simply because we are young, and it's just not true. Paul writes to Timothy, and he says this. He says, do not let anyone despise you for your youth. And I would say including yourselves. It's important. Not even yourself. Don't despise yourself because of your youth. But set the believers an example in speech, in conduct, in love, and faith, and in purity. Brother Bartley affirms you are an encouragement to him. I will affirm that. You are an encouragement to me. The fact that you even came up here, I know for some, may even be difficult to sit within spitting distance of the preacher. I understand that, but you did it, and you're interested, and you're paying attention, and you're locking eyes with me, and I appreciate that. And that says to me that you're concerned about this. And you want to know what we have to say and consider what we have to consider. And I think that says that you have a desire to please the Lord. And I want you to know that I'm incredibly encouraged by that. I do have a slide that I'll get to in just a minute, but it's going to be slightly delayed getting there this morning. But I just want to point your attention to some of the inspiring youth of the Bible before I give you some challenges that I think will be helpful for you in being faithful as the youth of the church, as the teenagers of the church, as the young adults of the church, faithfully fulfilling the role that you have, which is the role that everyone has, okay? Faithfully fulfilling your role to the church. There are some inspiring youth in the Bible. For instance, Joseph. You know, we've been talking about Joseph, and we're kind of at a place in our Bible readings. For some of the younger classes, I know most of you are not going through this 3-year study in your classes anymore in the high school class, But the younger ones have been going through this 3-year study of the Bible. And we're just now finishing the book of Genesis, and we've been studying we've been studying the character of Joseph off and on over the last few weeks. And here's the thing: if you look at Genesis chapter 37, in Genesis chapter 37, when we're really first introduced to Joseph, in Genesis chapter 37, and in verse 2. These are the generations of Jacob, but in that second part of that verse, Joseph was 17 years old. When Joseph first comes onto the scene in the biblical text, he's 17 years old. Now I know we're not reading a whole lot at this point about some of the incredible things and faith-inspiring things that Joseph does yet at this point, other than simply the fact that he has been given a sense of responsibility. Even though he's the favored, even though he's not out with the brothers, his father is utilizing him as an effective tool to keep charge over his brothers and to check on his brothers. But I don't even want to focus on that. I want you to look over just in chapter 41, for instance, in chapter 41 and in verse 1. We're kind of going to start here and do some backtracking to kind of dissect the age of Joseph, who was this incredible person of just trusting God in some of the most deepest and darkest things that he was called to endure, and how God was with him and blessed him in that. In chapter 41 and in verse 1, after 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. Okay, so we're going to kind of look backwards from, actually I didn't go far enough, chapter 41 and in verse 46. Chapter 41 and in verse 46, when Joseph is elevated to a position of power in Egypt over storing up things for the famine, he's 30 years old, okay? Chapter 41 and in verse 46, he's 30 years old. Okay, so now we backtrack to chapter 41 and in verse 1. At the age of 28 is when Joseph is called to interpret the dreams of Pharaoh. Now here's the thing. This is obviously 2 years. The text tells us this is 2 years when he interprets these dreams after he interprets the dreams of the chief baker and the chief butler. 2 years after that, well, let's just think about that for just a second. He interprets the dreams of the chief baker and the chief butler after enough time had passed where he established himself as a favorable person, a person who could be trusted and a person who could be granted stewardship even within the context of the prison, which he was there because of a lie that was told by Pharaoh's wife, but he was in that position because enough time had passed since he was 17 years old for him to have gained a place of prominence in Potiphar's house. And so we're looking at somewhere between the age of 17 and the age of 30. And when you kind of do some of the numbers and kind of do some guesstimating as to how far it was distance to here and distance to here, I'm just going to suggest, though still a little bit older than most of you, Joseph's probably in his young 20s when this occasion happens with Potiphar's wife. And the incredible confidence that he has in God, the incredible awareness that he has of God's presence in this most difficult moment, the grateful heart that he continued to show, the honesty, integrity that he had, is just incredible when you consider the fact that he was still such a young man. And I just want to suggest to you that, number one, I hope that gives you a little bit of confidence, but also I want to encourage you in some of the things we'll talk about later on. That kind of character doesn't happen by accident. It's not something that's just going to wake up one day and you're just going to have. But I think what it shows is that even as a really young man, Joseph was listening to the words of his father. He was listening to the father tell the story about God and how God took care of them and took care of his fathers and how God was with him and he was in the presence of God. And he heard Jacob talking about the promises of God that he heard Jacob talking about at the end of his life. Even Jacob, he wanted to die in Canaan, and he reminded Joseph, one day they're going to be in captivity here, but God's going to bring you back home. He saw that faith in his father, and he made investments in his own faith. His confidence in the Lord through the darkest times of his life was not something that happened by accident, but I believe it suggests Joseph was proactive in being the man that God called him to be. In 1 Samuel chapter 17, there's another story of a young man who did something absolutely incredible. You remember the story of David and Goliath, and how all of the armies of Israel stood back in absolute fear and terror of this giant who had set himself as an enemy against God's people. We don't know exactly how old David was, but we learn in 1 Samuel 17:33 that Saul initially wrote him off for his youth. And Goliath, in verse 42, ridiculed him for his youth. And in an odd reversal and a powerful reversal of roles, the giant became the weak one, and the weak one became the giant because of his incredible faith as a young man. Josiah came to the throne. Josiah came to the throne at the age of 8. At the age of 16, the text tells us he began to seek Jehovah. By the time he was 20, he began a movement to purge the kingdom of idolatry. At age 26, he made arrangements to repair the temple of God. And he was one that the text says in 2 Kings 23:25, there was none before or after him who sought the Lord with all his heart like Josiah did. And that's just an incredible thing to read these stories of such young people and the way in which they are proactively giving themselves to the Lord. I want you to turn just really quickly to Luke chapter 1, because there's another powerful example of faith in Luke chapter 1. And I hope this will be especially encouraging to our young women who are here, because if you're going to Luke chapter 1, you probably understand. I want you to see the character. I want you to see the trust and the faith that young Mary had. We don't know how old Mary was, but most people speculate just simply based on the customary time of engagement and marriage in Judaism at this day. most people speculate Mary's 15, 16 years old. And I want you to read with me a phrase that Mary utters as this angel has come to her, called her the favored one, told her the Lord is with her, told her what's going to happen. She's going to be the one in whose womb the Savior of the world is going to grow, and she's going to give birth to this child. And she's the one who is granted responsibility over bringing this child into the world and through the world and raising him to adulthood so he can fulfill the purposes that God has called him to fulfill. Mary says in verse 38, "Behold, I am the servant of the Lord. Let it be to me according to your word." Think about the faith of this young woman who has been called to this incredible task and responsibility and stewardship. The great sacrifice that it is going to cost her, what will people think about her, the 9 months of carrying this child, the having to go through the labor, the difficulties of parenthood, especially with the added stress and anxiety of knowing who this child was. But the response of this young woman to say, "I am the servant of the Lord, let it be to me according to your word." We're talking about being a living sacrifice this year. And I mean, that phrase characterizes it. Mary personifies it. Josiah personifies it. David, Joseph, and so many more that we could talk about. Why do I bring this up? Because I just want you to see, what you are capable of. I want you to see that God, by His strength and His incredible call, has equipped you and has enabled you to do incredible things in the kingdom of God. I read a book one time, and I'm going to allude to it when we get to some of the practical points that I want to give you this morning. Some of them are borrowed from this book, but have any of y'all ever read the book Do Hard Things by two twin brothers? Okay, Josiah, have you read it? But it's a pretty good book in principle. I read it when I was not till I was in my mid-20s, and there's some really great principles. But two teenagers who wrote this book encouraging the youth of our day to dismiss all the restrictions that our culture puts on what we call adolescence and simply do hard things, because young people are capable of incredible hard things. But the book kind of opens with an illustration that was really compelling to me, and I looked online and I found some references to this elsewhere as well. But it's kind of interesting. In India, you can go and you can see elephants, full-grown elephants, that are tied by a thin twine to a wooden stake that's in the ground. And I believe if you go back in the book and kind of read the illustration as it's given, as a visitor came into the country and he witnessed this, and he came into this city and he saw this huge elephant just tied with a small twine that it could easily snap with just a flinch of its leg, and even if not, just a movement of the leg would pull that little stake out of the ground, but the elephant just stayed there, wouldn't do it. And when the visitor to that area inquired about what was going on, they said when the elephants are babies, when they're really small, the twine and the stake are big enough to bind them. And so they had it tied around one leg where they can go within the perimeter, kind of like we do with dogs sometimes, right? They can go around the perimeter of the stake, but they can't go any further than that. And as a young elephant, they are incapable of snapping it or pulling it up. And they get used to the restriction. They get conditioned to the reality that they cannot go further than this, to such an extent, anytime they feel the pressure, they stop. As a young elephant, they cannot pull it up. But as they grow, they have this psychological bent towards that captivity, where anytime they feel that pressure around their leg, they feel as though they cannot bust out. And so they don't try. Any movement in resistance would free the elephant, but they are bound by psychological captivity. And the illustration was very good, simply to illustrate the fact that I think sometimes our young people, at least I feel like I was, and I'm sure many people have felt this way, we are bound and restricted by low expectations? By the expectation that young adults will be mediocre at best. But because we live in a day and a time in which we live, sometimes mediocrity is praised and celebrated when we serve a God who calls us not to mediocrity, but he calls us to excellence. And you're capable of that. Everybody in this room is capable of that. If we will simply break free from the psychological captivity that I can't do, that I'm not valuable, that I'm not significant, that there's work that I cannot do. It's simply not true. It's the product of psychological conditioning, and I'm going to tell you Satan's behind every ounce of it. Because he does not want young men and women to flourish into the men and women that God is calling them to be, because he knows that if they flourish into the kind of individuals that God is calling them to be, they're going to be the lights and the salt in the earth that he doesn't want them to be. So I want to begin kind of moving on from that by simply just reminding you of something that I mentioned in our last sermon. You are not the church of the future only. You're the church of the now. If you are a believer, if you are a Christian, if you are a child of God, a son or a daughter of the King, you are the church now. And I want you to see that. And I don't want you to accept expectations of mediocrity. I don't want you to accept psychological captivity. I don't want you to accept low expectations for yourself. If anything, I want you to push against them, not cater to them. I want you to turn your Bibles to Luke chapter 11. I'm going to tie it real quick back to what we talked about the last time in resisting temptation. Because I want you to see that important and necessary chapter 11 and in verse 24. In Luke chapter 11 and in verse 24, when the unclean spirit is gone out of a person, it passes through waterless places seeking rest. Finding none, it says, I will return to my house from which I came. And when it comes, it finds a house swept and put in order. And then it goes and brings 7 other spirits more evil than itself. And they enter and they dwell there. And the last state of the person is worse than the first. You see both sides of this, right? It's not just about casting things out of our lives, but it's making sure that we're furnishing our house with things that are good so that there's really no room for that stuff to come back in. And so we can talk, and necessarily so, we can talk about fleeing temptation and resisting sin and calling sin what sin is in the Bible and recognizing it and acknowledging it and doing our best to run from it. But I also want to encourage you, as you are running away from evil, to also run towards what is good. And to give yourselves actively in the service of your great God, the God who created you and saved you for good works, which is why you see such a consistent warning throughout the Bible against idleness. Proverbs 19:15, slothfulness cast into a deep sleep. An idle person will suffer hunger. Ecclesiastes 10:18, through sloth the roofs sink in, and through indolence the house leaks. Concerning the Proverbs 31 woman, in verse 27, she looks well to the ways of her household, and she refuses to eat the bread of idleness. Proverbs 13:4, the soul of the sluggard craves and gets nothing. The soul of the diligent is richly supplied. Proverbs 24:30-34, I passed by the field of a sluggard, by the vineyard of a man lacking sense, and behold, it was overgrown with thorns. The ground was covered with nettles, its stone wall was broken down, and I saw and considered it. I looked and received instruction. And a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest. And poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed man. Idleness is this state of stagnation and complacency in which one decides to sit where they are and not push forward to greater degrees, into new areas, to do the work that God has called one to do actively, diligently, with a great sense of responsibility. I want to encourage you this morning as young adults to see that it's never appropriate, regardless of your age, to fold the hands and to sit at rest. There is always good work that God has called you to do. There's always good work that you are capable of doing. Now I want to begin with a short list. Some of these, this first one is not, and some of these I've condensed and kind of paraphrased, but again, some of these points come from the book that I referenced earlier. But I want to begin with something specific that I wanted to put in here, just from my personal experience that I want to encourage you in. There are a few scenarios that I want you to avoid in your life. And one of them is not adequately feeding yourself. I'm going to talk about good things you can do beyond yourself, but I want to start here. I want you to see the significance and the importance of adequately feeding yourself personally as a child of God, because there are a couple of situations that are to be avoided, and I think probably most people who've just been at life for very long and experienced things within the context of the church have witnessed these things happen. Based on the reality that faith must be and increased, not neglected, as Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 1 talks about, that drifting. There are so many occasions when faith, especially as a young person, a new Christian, is not actively fed and growth is not actively pursued, what naturally happens is what naturally happens to a boat when it stops rowing in a current. We think we're the same place where we were 6 months ago, but we're not, because the current has put us adrift. And what tends to happen is when young Christians oftentimes fail to pursue the growth in the ways of faith, is their faith often fizzles. And when it is not fed, and when it is not paid attention to, and when it is not accommodated, and when it is not strengthened, oftentimes results in young people who leave the way of faith. And that's certainly something that we want to avoid. But I also want you to avoid another scenario, which is my own scenario, okay? I'm giving you a scenario from my own life. The second thing that I don't want to happen to you is for you to get 10 years down the road, turn around and think, where did the time go? And why am I no closer to the Lord than I was then? From someone who did not take their youth seriously, who did not redeem the days and make it my diligent attention to make the best use of them, I really want you to avoid that scenario. There are years of my Christian life that I did nothing with. I was stagnant and did not much of anything other than attend worship, go to Bible class. That's about it. I wasn't feeding my faith. I wasn't active in prayer. I wasn't leaning on the Lord. I wasn't practicing trust in Him. I wasn't making my decisions with Him as my highest purpose. I wasn't active in study. I wasn't meditating on His Word. And now I look back and I'm just absolutely sick over all the time that I wasted where I could have been advancing in my faith and strengthening myself in my faith. And the times that I face now that test my faith, I would be even stronger now than I am because I neglected so many of my days as a youth. And of course, now all I can do is forget what lies behind and strain forward to what lies ahead. And all I can do now is focus on today and each day God blesses me with. Make sure that 10 years from now, I don't look back and think the same thing, that my story will be very different. But again, coming back to the question of why am I talking to you specifically this morning, is to say don't do what I did. And I would say there's probably other people in this room who would give you the same encouragement. Not everyone, obviously. But don't waste your days. Make it your resolve and your commitment to feed your faith daily so that when you look at your faith in Christ Jesus 10 years from now, you'll find it on a whole new level. Prioritize personal growth now. It will greatly bless you in the future. Even if you don't understand how, just do it by faith and trust that God will make that clear to you. Okay, now let's move into some things very quickly as concerns the things of the book. Do things outside of your comfort zone. Do things outside of your comfort zone. Our comfort zones are nothing more than self-made prisons that hold us back from what we're capable of. So often we create those things because of lies that we're led to believe. And they simply become excuses to not do difficult but good work that we've been called to do. Moses made excuses. Gideon made excuses. And if we allow God to, He will overwhelm our excuses, remind us of His presence, and call us nonetheless to step out in faith. I'll give you an example. Megan was looking over my notes, and she recalled something specific she remembers happening just in the context of local work that you can do even here at Prince Street. Megan shared a story. She said that she'll always remember. She says she was in college and she was busy and she just had all these things going on. She was driving back and forth. She was coming here to worship. She was coming here from worship to worship all the way from Russellville, and just her college life was just very difficult. But she says she will always remember, despite all of that, Mike approached her and said, "Can I encourage you to teach a class and to co-teach?" I believe she said it was with Tanya at the time. "Can you co-teach? Will you sit in the Bible class and just learn what it's like and get to know what that's like?" And just kind of pushed her out of her comfort zone. And she said, "I was overwhelmed by it. My life was incredibly busy, but it was a push for growth that I very much appreciated and very much benefited from." And she said, of course, at the time I was preaching in Jacksonville when we got married. We were in Jacksonville. And she said, "Little did I know that just within a couple of years, she would be one of the main teachers at that congregation and helping to coordinate some of the women's teachers for the women's classes." And it proved to be a great service to her. That's just an example among many of someone's willingness to be pushed beyond what they're comfortable with. And the great impact that can have not only in your life, but in the lives of those who are affected by her willingness to teach, or your willingness to teach. Everybody in here who has taught a Bible class, by their willingness to teach, we don't understand the impact that we have. But it's an impact that would not have been had as a result of her teaching had she not been pushed out of her comfort zone. Be pushed out of your comfort zone. Number three, do things that go beyond what's expected. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, if someone compels you to go with him 1 mile, go with him 2. Go the second mile. That's not the way that our culture is. A vast majority, I think at least, it seems to me, have a get by with as little as possible mindset. But the one who is not content to just satisfy, but to excel at work, at school, and whatever you do, also when you're here. I believe there's incredible merit to that. And I believe that God would look upon that very favorably. Go up to a visitor and welcome them. I mean, just put yourself in this, adults, put yourself in this position. And you've had it happen before, because there's young people doing this all the time. You go into a new area, you're traveling, you go to a place you've never been to, a church you've never been to. People come to you and they greet you and they welcome you there. Is it more or less or the same meaningful when a teenager approaches someone they do not know, never have seen before, doesn't know your personality, how you're going to respond, if you're easy to talk to? Is it more or less or the same when a person of youth approaches you in that environment? I think we'd probably all unanimously say it's more impressive. And that's just a product of the psychological captivity, our low expectations, and that expectations for mediocrity. It's just like, well, they shouldn't have to do that. But I don't know where we come up with that. But also, young people, let me just encourage you. It's impressive when a person has the heart to welcome someone who is here for the first time, greeting you with a smile. It would be impressive because it would seem exceptional. It would seem exceptional because it's not the cultural norm. I want to encourage you to push back against normative captivity and be exceptional. Do things that are too big to accomplish alone. There are certainly things you can do alone, but there's benefit to bringing others into the work. It promotes fellowship amongst you all as you do things together or do things with the older members. I'm not saying be exclusive with one another, but be with the older people as well. We'll talk more about that in the next and last sermon that we'll do maybe next week or the following. But doing things together cultivates fellowship. Doing things together accomplishes more and lightens the load on everyone. Exemplified here, I think, in volunteer opportunities we have on the board back there, yard work, building cleanup, even meal lists when people are bedridden, at home sick, or those who have had a baby. Those opportunities are given as opportunities to pair up with someone and to do things together, and I think that's really a good practice. Maybe it's leaves that need to be raked at one of our older members' homes, and you recognize it, and you say, you know, I could do something. Instead of going over and doing it yourself, call one another and say, hey, meet me over there. Let's do this together. Would be exceptional. Do things that don't earn an immediate payoff. I believe this is an incredible training ground for faith. Our hope is a reality seen now only by faith, but one day it'll be by sight, and that's hard for us to base the whole of our lives on a reality that we know is there, but we know that we won't experience until this life is over. And because it's hard, coupled with the fact that we are negligent in our faith and often lose sight of it and focus on more of this world orientation, it becomes very dangerous to our hope. But part of maintaining that big idea mentality is practicing it in small ways. Will I immediately be wiser if I put everything aside and spend 30 minutes in the Word today? Maybe not. But I'm going to do it anyways because I know that the habit, if maintained, will reap a benefit. Will I feel good about having to tell my friends I can't go to that movie with them because I know there are things in it that I shouldn't be looking at? Not necessarily. But do it anyways, knowing that God sees, God cares, and God smiles. That He sees His beloved children making investments in their souls. Being exceptional will set you apart. And I think that's the idea of holiness, right? You are set apart. You are set apart as children of God, whether you're 13 or 99. Brother Bartley's not 99. Okay, he's not 99. But whether you're 13 or 105, it doesn't matter. You are sons and daughters of the great King, called to be set apart to a holy God. And I just want to encourage you, find your role and fulfill it. Be faithful to the call of an incredible God. The Bible has called you into His service. Flee temptation, but also run towards work, usefulness, faithfulness. Pursue growth. Serve where you can. And never underestimate your value or your significance to the Lord's body. Can I pray for you as we conclude and take our break? Our Father in heaven, Father, I pray that you would bless these young people. Father, it's an incredible group of young people, each and every single one of them. Father, I know they each have their struggles, things that they deal with, and weaknesses and questions that they have, Father. But I pray that you would help them to pour those things first out to you, to seek counsel, to lean on the older members, Father, and to pursue growth. Father, I know that you will bring them clarity as they grow and mature in your ways. But Father, as they push forward in their faith, I pray that you would help them to realize the great work that they can do in your kingdom and in this local body of believers. Father, so many of them are already doing acts of service in various ways. And Father, I would love to draw attention to each and every single one. But I simply lay this at your feet, knowing that you know. And I pray that you would strengthen and bless each one as they seek to grow in their walk with you. Father, may we utilize these young people. And may we push them that they might not simply rise to meet low expectations, but seek to excel in their faith. And Father, I pray that you would bless us as the older ones and as parents and as grandparents, Father. Help us to set an example for them. For we know that we can't expect them to live any way other than the way we live. Help us to model good works and speech and conduct. Help us to give them something to reach for and to attain to. Father, help us to model our lives after you the way that we hope they will model their lives. Father, we love you so very much. We thank you for blessing this congregation with so many young people. And we just pray that you would help them to flourish in their faith from this day